Hey, how you doing? This is Adam Post, publisher of more than 1,000 comic books, and I have been covering Disney pretty closely, and we now get more of the background information that, yep, just like I had said on Monday, a day before Disney announced publicly this was going on, Nelson Peltz was teamed up with Ike Perlmutter, the old nemesis of Bob Iger, who was very unhappy with how Marvel was treated and what they did with the franchises under Iger and Kevin Feige. And now it's kind of finally come to a head where Ike Perlmutter has teamed up with Nelson Peltz and they are going after control of Disney. This is a really interesting article. I had suggested that it seemed like something was going on there, but none of this had been public. This is from a video published 2 days ago, Woke Disney Attacked by Nelson Peltz and Ike Perlmutter. But I think Bob Iger is in some serious trouble, and I also think it explains why Bob Chapek was forced out, because going back to before Bob Chapek left Disney, Chapek was already speaking to Nelson Peltz and Ike Perlmutter. And Chapek probably would have supported Nelson Peltz being on the board of Disney. And that would have definitely pulled Disney away from Bob Iger's control. And it would have been the end of Woke Disney. So let's get into this article in Hollywood Reporter, it really is fascinating. It's coming out just after Disney published a whole timeline on when it met with Nelson Peltz and Bob Chapek met with Peltz and Iger met and talked to these people on the board. Really, all the background information, they are very nervous over at Disney, I can tell you that much. So the article's in Hollywood Reporter, behind Disney's activist investor battle, a Marvel mogul's revenge play. And by the way, I don't see this as revenge for Ike Perlmutter, where he's doing something out of revenge. He's not spiteful. He would just like for Disney to be straightened out, and I think he'd like the Marvel franchises to get back on track. If you look at what Marvel was during Phase 1 versus what Marvel is now, or Pixar when Pixar was acquired, to what Pixar is now, you look at Lucasfilm when it was acquired, to what it is now. All these brands have lost their luster because of the management of them of Disney. And it's not even because of greed, it's just because of wanting to push agendas. So behind Disney's activist investor battle, an activist shareholder Nelson Peltz presses a long shot fight for a seat on Disney's corporate board. With help from former Marvel honcho Ike Perlmutter, Bob Iger appears to be solidifying his control. In 2004, Roy Disney, Walt's nephew, summoned Disney shareholders to the company's annual meeting, asking them to oust then chairman and CEO Michael Eisner, who'd been running the place for 20 years. Roy had Walt's face, and his Save Disney movement brought emotional Disney-loving institutional shareholders of all ages to chilly Philadelphia, some leaning on canes and others with babies and strollers. After a stunning 43% voted against re-electing Eisner to the board, a new chairman was named immediately, and Eisner, despite vowing to remain as CEO until the end of his contract in 2006, departed in 2005. Doesn't this seem kind of similar? I do remember, I'm not 80 years old, but I do remember this battle to save Disney from Roy Disney and the disagreements with Michael Eisner on how it should be managed. It seems like Disney probably shouldn't have a CEO for more than 10 years. It's time to reboot at that point, because the CEOs lose their minds and go crazy and refuse to leave. Let me know if you agree with that in the comments below. At age 80, Nelson Peltz is old enough to remember one of the most successful shareholder revolts in corporate history. Presumably, he knows that he is no Roy Disney, and CEO Bob Iger, back on the job only since November 21st, is nothing like the increasingly imperious and isolated Michael Eisner of 2004. But together, he and his friend Ike Perlmutter, the former Marvel Entertainment CEO, who has some scores to settle with Iger dating back to 2015, can represent a tenacious, expensive, and distracting problem for Iger and the Disney board at a time when the entertainment company faces the same massive challenges affecting other legacy entertainment companies. Disney faces some of its own challenges with messes of its own making. Not every other entertainment company spent $71 billion to acquire Fox, which Disney still now tries to defend, saying like, well, but we got, 2/3 of Hulu and we got The Simpsons. The Simpsons is not worth $10 billion. They got some Marvel characters, but only now they're releasing Deadpool, a new Deadpool movie. Where's the new Wolverine movie? Where's the X-Men movie? Oh, that's right. They don't want to do X-Men movies because if you call them X-Men, it's not politically correct. So they're destroying all of the franchises. There's no way they can justify that Fox deal. It's just impossible. And this is the issue they really face. Whether or not Nelson Peltz gets on the board, and this is Ike Perlmutter, maybe he wants to join the board. I don't think so. I think it's just that's Nelson's job. But whether or not they keep Nelson Peltz off the board doesn't matter. Peltz is going to keep talking. And if you notice, Ike Perlmutter hasn't been talking, not yet. He could start talking tomorrow. People like Peltz, who's done this 30 times plus before with other big companies, they have their media and publicity narratives planned months and stages in advance. Iger's in a lot of trouble here. Iger, for whatever his thing is, he wants to desperately control what goes on at Disney. It doesn't seem like he's going to be able to do that. The development adds pressure as the company faces a 2-year ticking clock to find a successor for Iger, an effort led by Disney's new chairman, Nike executive Mark Parker. It also may restrict Iger's ability to maneuver as he might have wanted. Oh, it's going to mean that anything Iger says that he wants to do, he's going to be second-guessed, he's going to be undermined by Peltz and crew. And the thing is, with Peltz and crew, that's going to extend to other investors. There are going to be investors that when they hear what Nelson Peltz has to say, and he does even more publicity, he's going to get even more support. Iger is not going to be able to overcome this. At this point, Peltz's demands are far more modest than the dramatic changing of the guard sought by Roy Disney. The man is just asking for a board seat, but Disney is putting up stiff resistance. Peltz is raising some valid questions. Aside from the succession problem, for example, it's stating the obvious to say that streaming costs have yet to be reined in. But Iger has also some cards to play, aside from his reputation as one of the best executives in the business. Problem is that Iger has had success, and it was good and visionary to acquire good IP. Marvel was well worth it for $4 billion. Pixar was worth it for the roughly $10 billion. Lucasfilm was worth it for $4 billion. That's no problem. Those things were fine, even though they've managed them badly. Those are good deals. The problem is where Disney is right now. And the fact that even though Chapek mismanaged a lot, Chapek was following a lot of what Iger set up in the first place. And it still doesn't get Iger off the hook for a $71 billion purchase. And if he spent $71 billion because he needed to get control of Hulu, which I would say, is a bit much, but I could understand him doing that. That's fine, but then why have you now invested more than $11 billion in trying to launch Disney Plus if you already spent $70 billion getting control of Hulu? Why don't you just spend another $10 or $15 billion and buy out the last third of Hulu and use that as your platform? Why do you need a duplicative platform with Disney Plus? Iger has already moved to respond to the sense that Disney, under ousted CEO Bob Chapek, was price gouging at theme parks. Avatar: The Way of Water is still rolling, just the kind of mega hit that can drive many aspects of Disney's business, and there are more sequels ahead. But there isn't really a flywheel for Avatar. People don't know the names of the characters. People aren't really as interested in the merchandise as they used to be when we had Ike Perlmutter's Marvel. People loved those characters and would buy all kinds of Marvel merchandise. But Disney is so focused on pushing its new versions of socially correct political characters that people aren't interested in owning merchandise based on those. China just agreed to give valuable release dates to Marvel movies generally, which, by the way, that's great that China is going to distribute Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. It's going to help them. They're going to distribute Ant-Man. That's fantastic. But aren't you a little concerned that we're dependent on China now? Like, we already have this problem with Russia geopolitically, and now you're going to become more dependent on China? I mean, cash the checks, that's fine. But some questions should be asked is exactly what is our CEO's relationship with China that he can snap his fingers and all of a sudden China is sending us millions of dollars? I hope Peltz brings that up because that should be questioned. Not only are we extremely unlikely to see any Chinese villains in any Marvel movies, but presumably the talent will be well schooled to watch their words. So none of the talent will be allowed to say anything against China, because if you do, Disney will lose distribution in China. Something Bob Iger apparently was very good at setting up. But those kind of conditions should be discussed on the board, and the shareholders should be aware of what deals Bob Iger is making with China on Disney and the shareholders' behalf. Peltz could hardly have intended this challenge to come at a time when Disney's fans are still rejoicing in Iger's return. I don't know how many people are really rejoicing about Iger. He started chatting with Chapek in Paris last July and maintained a dialogue in the ensuing months. No way. I mean, Peltz definitely could have worked Chapek and gotten control of something over there. To me, that's why understanding that Peltz was so involved, because this hasn't been published before now, Peltz was so involved behind the scenes with Chapek and having meetings and discussions and explaining that he wanted to be on the board even before Peltz made an investment. He explained that to Chapek. You can understand the Iger crew having a freak out and saying, oh my God, Chapek is going to bring Peltz on the board. We got to get rid of Chapek. It was also in July that Perlmutter began lobbying for his pal, calling Chapek Disney CFO Christine McCarthy and Disney board member Safra Catz less than a week after Peltz dined with Chapek in Paris. At the time Peltz approached Chapek, he was dealing with a CEO who had been absolutely convinced just a month earlier that he was about to face execution by the Disney board. Instead, a divided board agreed to extend his contract, though it was backdated, giving him less than 3 years as a term. The board then presented this result as unanimous. It's understandable that at the time, Chapek might have felt that he could have used a friend or two, and that seemed to be on offer. Mr. Perlmutter said he and Mr. Peltz supported Mr. Chapek, and that adding Mr. Peltz to the board would help Mr. Chapek counter recent headwinds he had faced, solidify his position as CEO, and preempt any other potential shareholder nominations of director nominees at the 2023 annual meeting. Disney wrote in its preliminary proxy filing January 17th. He said without Mr. Peltz there, former executives including Mr. Iger would be back at Disney. And how right he was. Peltz is more known for targeting blue-chip companies like consumer product giant Procter & Gamble and the Wendy's fast food chain. But of course, his friend Perlmutter was very familiar with Disney, had in fact been one of its largest individual shareholders. Recall that the penny-pinching, gun-toting Perlmutter seized control of Marvel in 1997 and sold it to Disney in 2009. He remained as Marvel Entertainment's CEO, but in 2015, Iger decreed that Kevin Feige, then running Marvel Films, would no longer report to Perlmutter, but to then film studio chief Alan Horn. In his memoir, Iger wrote that Perlmutter had stood in the way of Marvel's first films with black and female leads. Quote, I called Ike and told him to tell his team to stop putting up roadblocks and ordered that we put both Black Panther and Captain Marvel into production, Iger wrote. Could you imagine if they were able to have stopped Captain Marvel? How good that would have been for Marvel. Feige sealed his control over Marvel when he took on responsibility for television, animation, and print editorial operations in October 2019. Peltz and Perlmutter have more in common than their age. Perlmutter is also 80, and Palm Beach addresses. They've shared pursuits in philanthropy, politics, and sending turkeys to the Salvation Army at Thanksgiving, and they both had supported Donald Trump's Oval Office bid. Disney had attracted the attention of another activist shareholder in recent history. We covered those with a couple of videos. Dan Loeb, the billionaire, in September, making a deal that included giving former Meta executive Carol Everson a seat on its board. What wasn't known at the time was that Loeb was publicly facing down Disney. Peltz and Perlmutter were privately doing the same. At an August 20 board meeting, the Disney board discussed the various approaches from Mr. Peltz, Mr. Perlmutter, and Mr. Loeb, the thesis put forward by Third Point, and the lack of a thesis put forward by Mr. Peltz. The following month, Disney representatives met with Loeb, leading to Everson's appointment. It's funny because Disney is just desperate for Nelson Peltz to put out a plan and say, see, we don't think this plan would work. It's not woke enough. Peltz will not put out a plan other than to say there's obviously a lot of things wrong with the decisions being made, and the first thing missing is accountability. Nobody who agreed to the Fox acquisition was held accountable at Disney, for example. It's clear that Fox was not worth $71 billion. So at the very least, Disney has to admit publicly, hey, look, we overpaid and we have to adjust our finances and show that, yes, we overpaid $25, $30 billion for Fox, and they have to charge it off on their assets. It's a very big deal that they do that. Peltz, after months of haranguing in private, pounced after Disney reported earnings that dramatically missed market expectations on November 8th, 2022, acquiring a $900 million stake in the company. As Disney's share price plummeted, Peltz called Chapek to ask for a formal meeting and a board seat. On November 12th, Chapek ventured to Palm Beach, where he met with both Peltz and Perlmutter, and the two continued their discussions to encourage the addition of Mr. Peltz to the board and again express support for Mr. Chapek. If you just put Peltz on the board and give Disney a year or 2 years, they could straighten out so much. A lot of the waste of money of costs, but also all of the stuff that's diminishing the franchises. And we all know what's diminishing the franchises. 8 days later, Chapek was dismissed. So after Chapek went to Palm Beach with Nelson Peltz and Ike Perlmutter, 8 days later, Chapek was out. Well, what does that tell you? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Don't you think that had something to do with him meeting and kind of being agreeable to working with Nelson Peltz? With the news that Disney's board had reinstalled Iger as CEO, Disney's share price rallied more than 6%. The picture at Disney had changed, but Peltz and Perlmutter persisted. Peltz's Trian Fund initially opposed Iger's return as CEO, suggesting that Peltz may have had another candidate in mind. The activist investor had dropped that argument while continuing to push for the board seat, telling Disney's board earlier this month he did not want to fire Mr. Iger, but he did want to be in the boardroom. He also said that he wanted to make sure that Iger was planning to leave after the 2 years as announced. But still, the asks seem simple. While other activists have challenged Disney to make bold moves like spinning off ESPN and ABC, Peltz was asking for a bit more fiscal restraint, a move the company appears to be making. They have different ideas about how to control costs at Disney, and Iger is never going to go as far as Peltz would go. At this point, Iger still seems to be solidifying control over Disney. Conveniently, board chair Susan Arnold, who'd backed Chapek despite the misgivings of fellow board members, is at the end of her term, so she's stepping down because it was 15 years that she was on the board of Disney, and they have this hard rule that you're only be allowed to be on there for 15 years. Iger lost no time in purging Chapek's deputy, Kareem Daniel, who he dismissed at 6:30 a.m. after the surprise Sunday evening announcement. Kareem Daniel was head of Disney Media Distribution. That was a whole concept that Chapek was very big on, where it inflated their costs tremendously. That was something that Iger's did not do, was not his fault, and Iger is correct that that has to be eliminated. It's become a tremendous drain on the company. In the wake of Iger's return, some sources believe that McCarthy was vulnerable for having backed Chapek too enthusiastically until she didn't back him anymore. The reorganization that gave Daniel the power of the purse increased her sway as well. All the various divisions' chief financial officers reported to her and Daniel. One Disney veteran believed that she was positioning herself to expand her influence still further. As the Wall Street Journal reported in December, McCarthy had spearheaded a move to hire the consulting firm McKinsey last year to explore cost-cutting measures. So that was her idea, to bring in McKinsey to do the cost-cutting. Probably because she knew that Bob Chapek couldn't handle it, and they really do need to pare back the costs. They need to cut costs. And Bob Iger has started that, but it needs to happen a lot faster. McCarthy reveled in the expanded power of corporate, says one Disney veteran. She'd probably enjoyed more power and influence in the company than any other time in her career. The hiring of McKinsey was her idea, and they hired McKinsey with an absolute agenda. McKinsey also only came in for like 2 months. They did an assessment of who they thought they could fire. They had sort of a plan, and they were going to move forward with it, and then Chapek was out like a couple days later. McCarthy had long-standing relationships on Wall Street in her favor, with Peltz pounding on the door. Iger is likely to find that a unified front is best. There's no way that Iger is going to be kicking out McCarthy right now. They really have to circle the wagons and see what they can do to defend themselves. They're going to have a big problem, because there really is no legitimate argument why Nelson Peltz shouldn't be on the board. He spent $900 million buying their stock. He's passionate about Disney, whether he's right or he's wrong. It's not if he goes on the board just because Nelson Peltz is on the board, everyone has to say whatever he does. He only has one vote, but he is very persuasive. He is a self-made billionaire. He's done this 30 times plus before. He's going to be pretty much correct. It's going to be hard to argue with his logic. With Iger already initiating major changes, it seems likely that shareholders will give him more time to reveal his plans for dealing with the admittedly daunting challenges facing Disney. What's funny is you really haven't heard Iger say anything about what his plans are for Disney. He said a couple of things, but nothing like on the order of what you'd have to say. The big announcement recently from Iger was, we are only going to allow 1 day a week to work hybrid. You have to come into the office at least 4 days a week. Okay, well, yes, that will get rid of a bunch of employees, and that's a sneaky way of getting people to quit. But you got to do better than that. We agree with Trian that many of Disney's wounds are self-inflicted and need to be addressed, wrote MoffettNathanson's Michael Nathanson in a January 12th note. But CEO Iger's return will force Disney to have an honest and courageous self-examination on what's working and what needs to be fixed. While we think Trian is correct to identify these issues, we believe that given the challenge in leadership, the company will quickly move to drive better profitability. What's really funny is, if it's so easy to be profitable and drive profitability with the same management, then why haven't they just done it already? Do they want to lose billions of dollars? Is that something they're interested in doing? Or is it that they have another priority other than profitability? Disney, meanwhile, officially fired back at Peltz on January 17th with a presentation of its own, using his own words on CNBC against him, that he's not an expert in theme parks, and answering why not when asked by CNBC why he's focusing on Disney. In deciding not to voluntarily offer Peltz a board seat, the board came to the conclusion that despite months of engagement, Mr. Peltz had not, and the Trian Group representatives at the meeting had not, actually presented a single strategic idea for Disney, that their assessment of Disney seemed oblivious to the secular change that had been going on in the media industry, as well as the impact of the pandemic on each part of the company's business, from production to exhibition to leisure travel. Disney stressed Iger and his experience to lead the company through the challenging moment facing the company and to help find a successor, with the board noting that Iger is assisting the board in identifying, developing, and mentoring a successor CEO, a process which he has already begun. That last bit will fire up some speculation. Stressing the secular change in the business is likely to carry weight on Wall Street. In fact, analyst Rich Greenfield had made the point using some of the same language even before the most recent Disney filing. He noted that Disney is hardly alone in facing strong headwinds, and that Peltz had entirely neglected that point in his criticisms of the company. There are major secular changes facing the entire sector, Greenfield said, given that it feels like Peltz doesn't understand media in 2023. No, that's not the case. What Peltz is saying is, look, I'm not telling you what Marvel actors to hire. I'm not telling you how to fix Star Wars. What I'm telling you is two things. One, The business is structurally a mess. It's an absolute mess. Iger knows they need to do layoffs. Chapek knew they had to do layoffs. The CFO knew they had to do layoffs. Nelson Peltz has said they had to do layoffs. Dan Loeb said they had to do layoffs. Everybody knows that Disney has way too much expenses and is incredibly inefficient in how it's doing business. This is when you're looking at a problem, you're looking at like, all right, well, what are the big obvious things first? The way you spend money on things is insane, Bob Iger. Fox was ridiculous. I could understand him wanting to acquire Fox. $71 billion. They got control of Hulu, and that was one of the very few streaming options at the time. Yes, I can see that, but it wasn't worth as much as they paid. They need to be honest with the rest of the stockholders and with Wall Street and say, listen, we overpaid. We need to take like a $30 billion charge. Additionally, the way they're managing the streaming service is insane. They've lost $11 billion. Why did you lose $11 billion setting up streaming and it's still not really working? It's not like all the companies that do streaming lose money. Netflix isn't losing money. And while Netflix was in business long before Disney was with streaming, come on, Disney has advantages that Netflix doesn't have. Namely, supposedly, all this intellectual property and their Disney films and TV shows. They have a lot of stuff to work with. But that said, if they couldn't run the business in such a way where they weren't going to lose what's looking like billions and billions and billions of dollars on streaming, again, why didn't you just buy Hulu outright? It only would have cost another $10 or $15 billion. You would have had full ownership of Hulu by now, and you can put your Disney shows on that platform. Why not? Let me know what you think of all this in the comments below. Do you think they got rid of Bob Chapek because he was obviously starting to side with Nelson Peltz and Ike Perlmutter? I'm starting to think that. Do you think that Iger's going to find a way to sneak out of this? Because I don't know. I don't think he can. Love to see what you think in the comments below. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Click the bell for notifications. Give me a thumbs up. And I'll see you again soon with another video. And if I don't see you, I will miss you.